Hey everyone, my name is Nejad Bajos, and in today's video I wanted to do a comparison between some picture profiles for Canon cameras. So one of the cool things about having a Canon camera is that you can actually install custom picture profiles to it. The most popular profile, besides the ones that are built into the Canon cameras already, is the Cinestyle profile, which I have installed on my Canon 80D, and I also have Andrew Reid's C-Log installed. And there are a couple other profiles. James Miller has a version of C-Log, which from what I've seen looks pretty similar to Andrew Reid's C-Log. So Andrew Reid's and James Miller's should be pretty similar. So the test that I do with Andrew Reid's C-Log should be pretty similar to James Miller. And Vision Color is just kind of a slightly less flat version, kind of like Cinestyle. Vision Color does cost 10 bucks, I believe, and then James Miller's C-Log, I believe, is the same price as Andrew's, around 20-ish bucks. So I'm just gonna give you a comparison between Andrew Reid's C-Log and Cinestyle, as well as the inbuilt profile that I use on my Canon 80D. Now, I haven't actually compared these super in depth yet, but I will say that I think shooting with the Canon profiles does give me the sharpest image. I think that Andrew Reid's C-Log takes a lot of that sharpening out, as well as Cinestyle. Although as far as sharpness, I would probably say it's Canon, Cinestyle, and then the C-Log. Whereas I think the C-Log gives me the most dynamic range, but at the same time, just playing with it a bit, it almost seems like, if you mess with your curves in, Premiere or something like that, it does seem like the shadows are just artificially bumped up and you're not actually seeing more shadow detail. You're just getting muddier shadows in at least the tests that I've done. So I'm gonna actually go out and shoot with all these profiles and do some tests, see how each of them grade, and then give you my final conclusions at the end of this video. So without any further ado, let's get into shooting, and I'll come back to you with my conclusions at the end. So yeah. All right, I just went out to the Columbia River Gorge and I found a shot that had a good amount of dynamic range, and that's kind of the main purpose of having a different picture profile on your camera, is to boost the dynamic range. So what I did was I shot the exact same scene 3 times using the Canon profile, which was in neutral with the contrast and saturation turned all the way down. And then I used Andrew Reid's C-Log, and then I used Technicolor Cinestyle. And I got back and I looked over the footage, and one of the things that I found was, as I expected, the Canon profile gave me the sharpest image. That's because I didn't turn any of the internal sharpening down. I didn't boost it at all, but I just kept it exactly where it was. So that kind of gave a sharper image. Maybe it's not the best way to do it. I would always suggest sharpening your video in post using the unsharp mask, which I did a little tutorial on how to do that. Put the card up there. But yeah, so the Canon definitely gave me the most sharpness, but straight out the gate I could tell that I wasn't getting as much dynamic range. The highlights were clipping a lot when I tried to expose for the shadows. So in this next scene, I shot it with Andrew Reid's C-Log, and as you can tell, the shadows do look kind of muddy. If you switch between the Canon scene and the C-Log scene, you can tell that you're not really getting more information in the shadows. They're just almost being artificially boosted, and you're not actually seeing more detail. So that's one thing to just keep note of, is that with the C-Log profile, you're not actually getting a lot more detail in the shadows. It's just kind of artificially bumping the shadows up. At least that's what it looks like to my eye. I did see a nicer highlight roll off though with Andrew Reid's C-Log, which is something that I actually really like. And then we switch over to the Technicolor Cinestyle, and one thing that I could tell right off the bat is that the colors were way better in Cinestyle than they were in C-Log. Now obviously that's to be expected. C-Log is more flat than Cinestyle, but one thing that I did notice with C-Log is that I was losing a lot of the colors and I'd have to boost them back up in post. But with C-Log, it retains a lot of the colors within the shot, but also gives you a little bit more dynamic range. As you can see, if you switch between C-Log and Cinestyle, There isn't a huge difference, but Cinestyle is definitely a little more crushed and not as flat, and the shadows don't look as artificially like boosted, in my opinion. So what I wanted to do next was zoom in to the shadows, because this is one thing that everybody complains about with Cinestyle, is that there's a lot of noise in the shadows. Now that's probably true. I was shooting at a really low ISO. I was shooting at ISO 100, which would give you the least amount of noise. But if you zoom in to all three of these images at like 100% and look at the shadows, none of them are really just screaming at you like, hey, this is a bunch of noise here that's non-usable. I think all of these images are totally usable. Now I think if you're using an older camera with ISO performance that isn't really that good, like any of the older Canon cameras like the T3i, EOS M, using Cinestyle, I definitely experienced that ISO noise in the shadows. And I think that's just because Cinestyle, and even if you're using C-Log, it's like trying to boost the shadows up too much. And so you're just getting a bunch of noise in the shadows because the ISO performance isn't that great. But I think on cameras like the 80D, Cinestyle, and C-Log, really, you're not gonna see a lot of noise in the shadows unless you're using a higher ISO. And because of that, I wanted to try to test all three of these profiles in a more darker lit scenario. So I filmed my little puppy Mabel in all three of these different picture profiles. And again, I think that the Canon, it's not flat really. It's, you know, all of the shadows are crushed. The C-Log and the Cinestyle profiles, you can see some noisiness in the shadows. I was shooting at ISO 320, so there's a little bit more noise in the shadows, but really, it's not really that bad. So with these profiles, I also wanted to test how LUTs would work on them. And I used a LUT specifically designed for C-Log, and then I just applied it to all three of them, just lowering the intensity a little bit, which I think the LUT used on the C-Log footage looks really great, but I almost like it even better on the Cinestyle profile because I don't have to really do anything with it. All I gotta do is lower the intensity, the colors are already there, the dynamic range is great. And on the Canon profile, I do have to like take it down on the intensity a little bit and kind of like bring down the highlights a little bit because the Canon profile does clip the highlights a lot. So anyways, that was my quick overview of those three profiles. The profile that I'm probably gonna be using the most is Cinestyle, and I'll use C-Log when I just want to get a little bit more dynamic range, and I'm planning on using some LUTs that are specifically designed for C-Log. But for just normal YouTube stuff, I'm probably just going to be using the Canon profile just because it really is the easiest to grade. I really don't have to do that much to it. Just do a couple minor tweaks in Adobe Premiere and then I'm good to go. So what profile should you use on your Canon camera? Well, I guess it really just depends on what you're doing. Cinestyle is definitely a great profile and it's free and you can get it on the Technicolor website. It definitely is going to give you some problems if you're using an older camera with not so good ISO performance. But if you're using a camera like the T7i, the SL2, the 80D with the newer sensors and better ISO performance, you shouldn't really have that much issues with it. And the C-Log profile, it does cost 20 bucks from EOS HD, but I definitely think that it's a good profile to have if you want to just boost the dynamic range ever so slightly and be able to use LUTs that were designed for C-Log. But I think for normal everyday use, if you're a YouTuber, the internal profiles on the Canon cameras, the neutral profile with the contrast and saturation and even the sharpness turned down are perfectly sufficient for making YouTube videos. And unless you actually really need that extra push and dynamic range, I say you could just roll with the internal Canon profiles or just go get Cinestyle if you want to mess around with a slightly flatter image. Anyways, that was my overview of those three profiles. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope it was helpful for you. If it was, it'd be great if you hit the like button and be sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to see more content from me. You can even hit that bell if you want to be notified for when I upload new stuff. As always, there's links in the description to a bunch of gear that I use and links to my Selfie account if you want to buy some of my LUTs or to my Patreon if you want to support me there. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching and I will see you all in the next video. Later.